Diagnosed as a psychopath, this serial killer is possibly the worst the UK has ever seen. My name's Emma, and I would like to tell you the case of Peter Tobin. This case does come with some warnings. This is probably one of the more gruesome ones that I've ever done, so if you do not like graphic content surrounding murder and mutilation, please click on a different video. Peter Tobin was born in 1946 in Glasgow. He was the youngest of 8 siblings. He was a very difficult child. He had a lot of behavioural problems. When he was 7 years old, he was sent to a behavioural school. Officially, this is called an approved school, and it's basically for kids where there is no parental control. It is for children who have incredibly disruptive behaviour and are often violent. In 1965, he was convicted of burglary and sent to a youth detention centre at age 19. So there were very early warning signs in Peter's behaviour as a child and a teenager. 4 years later, in 1969, he began courting 17-year-old Margaret Mountney. They met at a dance hall, and Margaret said initially Peter was very charming. He would take her for drives around the locks. However, this begins to disintegrate quite quickly, and as soon as their relationship begins to get serious, Peter's true side emerges. He begins to get quite violent, abusive. Margaret does end up marrying him, but she says he essentially kidnapped her. So Peter basically kidnapped Margaret and forced her to marry him. The violence in their marriage soon escalated and became very dangerous. One evening, Margaret and Peter's puppy was barking and yelping constantly. Peter's solution to this, he was getting so annoyed, he decapitated the puppy. Whenever he would get annoyed or angry at Margaret, he would beat her. He would grape her, sexually assault her, at knife point often. He would also lock her in the flat for hours on end, sort of holding her hostage. On one evening, he essayed her with a knife, causing irreparable damage to her genitals. After this violent attack, he just left the flat. Margaret was lying there, just bleeding out, and the only reason why she got any help was the neighbour downstairs in these blocks of flats noticed blood dripping down from the ceiling. She ran up to see what was wrong and found Margaret. Margaret then got medical help. She survived, but the damage caused to her genitals left her unable to bear any children. In 1971, Peter once again is imprisoned for burglary. During this time, whilst he's in prison, Margaret takes the opportunity and flees. She also files for divorce. Just under a year later, he is released from prison and he decides to relocate to Brighton, which is on the south coast of the UK. It is there that he meets and marries 30-year-old nurse Sylvia Jeffries. They have a son called Ian and a daughter called Claire. Claire unfortunately passes away at just 2 days old. She has respiratory issues. Sylvia, the mother and wife of Peter, later recounts that she felt as though her daughter Claire escaped her father's abuse. Her passing was sort of a blessing. Peter did his usual thing. When he was courting Sylvia, he was charming, he was nice, he was incredibly kind, but once the relationship began to get more serious and once they were married, this is when it really started to deteriorate and the violence escalated. So Sylvia did state that she married Peter out of fear. Once again began to abuse their pets, specifically their dog. He was very violent towards the dog, and this abuse and physical violence then switched to Sylvia. He would strangle her daily, particularly during intercourse. After a few years, Sylvia actually managed to escape and she went to a women's refuge with her son Ian. Although she was free physically from Peter, she spent years afterwards fearing that he would come after her. She said the mental damage that relationship caused her has been lifelong. In 1984, at the age of 38, Peter is now living in Portsmouth, which is on the southeast coast of England again, around an hour away from Brighton. He's living in a council flat, in a block of flats. Over the course of 2 months of living there, he has been SAing an 8-year-old girl who lives next door. She tells her parents, but due to insufficient evidence deemed by the police, Peter is never arrested. 5 years later, at the age of 43, he marries a 16-year-old girl, Kathy Wilson. He is 27 years her senior. This is a man marrying a child. Although the age of consent here is 16, she's still a little girl. She's still at school. They end up having a son called Daniel, and Peter would often use Daniel to manipulate and abuse Kathy. So Kathy came from a troubled background. She grew up in foster care in children's homes. She witnessed her own mother being abused by various men, including at one point a man set her mother's hair on fire. So she was a troubled girl, and I think she believed that marrying this older man who was most likely very charming at the beginning and provided some stability for her, she thought she was being saved. This was so far from the truth. So after they had their son, Peter began to be incredibly violent towards Kathy, and he said that if she ever told anyone, he would kill their son Daniel. He also began bringing sex workers home and abusing them in front of Kathy. He would choke them. A year later, in 1990, Peter decided to relocate himself, Kathy, and his son Daniel back up to Scotland to a town called Bathgate. In 1991, in February, a 15-year-old girl, Vicky Hamilton, went missing from a bus stop in Bathgate, the same town where Peter is now residing in. For 11 days, the police search for her and cannot find anything. And then one day, a man is on his way to work and he discovers her purse just on the floor. It's completely intact, it's dry, so it obviously hasn't been out there long. The police collect this evidence, but at the time it doesn't really lead anywhere. In August of that year, in 1991, so 6 months later, 18-year-old Dinah McNicol goes missing. Dinah McNicol lives in Hampshire, so we're back down to the south coast of England again. She and a male friend have attended a music concert together, and afterwards they decide to catch a lift home from a stranger. After this stranger drops the male friend off, Dinah is never seen again. For over a week after Dinah goes missing, her bank card is used every day at various different locations across England. During this time, Peter does kind of move around, and in 1993, so 2 years later, Peter does decide to relocate to Hampshire. He moves to an area called Lee Park, which is a large council estate in Havant off the south coast of England. He's there in a flat with his son Daniel, and he decides to invite over two 13-year-old girls on the pretense that they would be babysitting his son, who's around 4 years old. When these girls arrive, Peter Tobin forces them to take medication and alcohol at knife point. This medication has the side effect of making them drowsy. Once they are under the influence of this medication and they're not completely aware of their surroundings, Peter Tobin then grapes one of the girls and SAs the other. After this horrific attack on these two very young girls, Daniel, his son, wakes up. It's 2 a.m. and he's sort of woken up in the middle of the night. Peter grabs his son, Daniel's mum, Kathy, and says, "Look, I'm having a heart attack. Something's not right. You need to come and get Daniel." He grabs Daniel, leaves the flat, and as he's leaving, he turns on the gas cooker. He doesn't ignite the hob, he just turns on the gas and leaves the flat. At this point, I imagine his plan is for the girls to die of carbon monoxide poisoning. He has bound their wrists and ankles so they can't move. An hour or so later, one of the girls does come round. She becomes conscious. She manages to get her wrists out of these constraints and phone the police. Police take a detailed report and a description of Peter Tobin. They do, however, put out an appeal on BBC Crime Watch, which was a big television programme back in the day where they would say about certain cases. This was on national TV, so everybody saw it. Peter Tobin is now on the run and he begins to use different aliases. So under the name Peter Williamson, he decides to join a kind of religious community. They, however, see this appeal on BBC Crime Watch. They see a sketch artist's face of Peter Tobin and realise that's Peter Williamson. They contact the police and Peter is arrested. He is found guilty for the attacks on those two young girls and is sentenced to 14 years in prison. He serves just 10. He's released in 2004 and he moves back to Scotland to a town called Paisley. When he's there, he uses a different alias and he makes some friends. One of those is a lady called Cheryl McLachin. And on one evening, they are sat on the couch, just kind of watching TV, when Cheryl looks to the side and notices that Peter has now got a belt and a tie. She gets incredibly worried, starts to kind of freak out and tries to get out of the flat. Peter Tobin grabs her, attacks her with a knife. He only ends up slicing her hand, but the psychological impact of this attack stays with Cheryl throughout her entire life. She manages to escape, no other harm is done, but since then she's often turned to drink to numb the fear and the pain. She's also since had trouble sleeping and just can't settle in one location anymore. Cheryl contacts the police about this attack, but they didn't bother to go to Peter's flat till the day after, so by that point he had gone. So a warrant is out for his arrest, not only for the attack, but also he is on the sex offenders register, so he needs to let police know where he is and he needs to remain there. So he's on the run and he begins to use more aliases again. In 2006, he joins another religious community under the name of Pat. Now, within this religious community, he's kind of the handyman. He does odd jobs, sort of cash in hand to get by. Within this religious community is a young Polish girl called Angelika Kluk. She's staying at one of the religious houses. On the 24th of September 2006, she is last seen with Peter Tobin. After that, her body is discovered under the floorboards of the church. She had been beaten, essayed and stabbed, and the forensics suggest that she was still alive when she was placed under those floorboards. Peter Tobin has also fled. He is now nowhere to be seen. So he was the last person to be seen with her. She disappeared. 5 days later, her body is discovered and Peter has now gone. He is actually picked up at a hospital in London, like a psychiatric hospital, where he had admitted himself under a different alias again. He is arrested on the charge of murder for Angelika Kluk. He pled not guilty at trial and said that his relationship with Angelika was consensual. However, the forensic evidence against him was so damning. His sperm was found on her underwear. A sort of tea towel had been shoved into her mouth, which had his DNA on it. Also, his fingerprints were everywhere. They also found a pair of Peter's jeans that were absolutely soaked in Angelika's blood, which he had placed in one of the church bins. So in 2007, he is found guilty for the murder of Angelika Kluk. He is given life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years. After this conviction, they begin to think about what other crimes could Peter have committed, and the police open up Operation Anagram to deep dive into a lot of cold cases to see if there is any correlation between the case and Peter's location and MO. They look at the death of 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton, who died in 1991, and her purse was found by that man who was going to work. Science has evolved at this point. It's now the early 2000s, and they managed to get some DNA off of this purse, and it matches up to Daniel, so the son of Peter. So Vicky Hamilton went missing from a bus stop in Bathgate, so the police decide to go back to Peter's old flat in Bathgate to search it. They discover a dagger which had Vicky's DNA all over it. They also travel down to Margate, where he was living on the south coast of England, and do a search of that property, including the garden. When they begin digging up that garden, they find the remains of 2 women or girls. One of those is 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton, and the other is 18-year-old Dinah McNicol. Dinah McNicol was the 18-year-old girl who attended a music concert with her friend, got a ride back home and was never seen again. He had wrapped their bodies in sort of curtains and bin liners. He had also cut them both in half from the waist. From forensics, they also believe that he had drugged both Vicky and Dinah before murdering them and possibly SAing them. Also with Vicky, where obviously the crime was committed in Bathgate, Scotland, he drove over 100 miles from there to the south coast of England with her body in the car in order to bury it in the garden of his Margate flat. In 2008, he was convicted for the murder of Vicky Hamilton, receiving a life sentence, serving a minimum years of 30. And in 2009, he was convicted of the murder of Dinah McNicol. He also received another life sentence. Because he was given so many life sentences at this point, he was then given a whole life order, which means that he is now serving life without parole. So Peter Tobin moved around the country so much and used so many aliases that they believe there are many other victims, including Susan Long, who was 18 when she disappeared in 1970. Her body was discovered and she had been essayed and strangled. Pamela Exel, she disappeared off a campsite in 1974. Oddly enough, the jewellery that Peter wears is very similar to the jewellery that Pamela was last seen in. If this is true, if Pamela was one of his victims, is he just wearing it around like a trophy? Louise Kay was 18 when she disappeared and her body was never discovered. Nicola Payne was an 18-year-old mum who disappeared just outside her parents' house in 1991. Peter Tobin himself says that he's murdered 48 women. There's also a theory that he is the Bible John murderer, and these were murders that happened in the 1960s. There are similarities in the sort of artist sketch of Bible John and Peter himself. One of the witnesses said that the perpetrator, Bible John, was missing a tooth, and Peter had had a tooth removed early on in life. All three women of the Bible John murders, Patricia Docker, Jemima MacDonald, and Helen Puttock, were beaten and strangled. They were all menstruating at the time, and Peter did have a history of violence towards women on their period, so this would fit with the MO of Bible John. Other people are more skeptic. They don't think that these women would be Peter's general target. They were a lot older. They were in their 30s and late 20s. Also, Operation Anagram, the operation that the police set up after the conviction of Angelika Kluk, found no evidence tying Peter Tobin to the Bible John murders. Other people, though, are really convinced, and one of the witnesses to Bible John said that this man was sort of showing off. He doesn't drink, and he was saying that he had a cousin who had once scored a hole-in-one at a game of golf. This is also a story that Peter Tobin would show off about and sort of boast to his friends. In prison, he suffered with pretty bad health. He was also attacked by another inmate and slashed across the face. He was quite isolated in prison and he rarely left his cell. And on October 2022, he died aged 76. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered at sea, as no family or next of kin ever claimed his body. That was the disturbing case of Peter Tobin and the sad demise of his victims Vicky Hamilton, Dinah McNicol, and Angelika Kluk. If you have any case suggestions, please let me know in the comments. My name's Emma. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you next time.